Good morning, church. It's so good to, be here with you. I'm here at the church, and it's wonderful to be here. But it's nice to know that you're out there listening as well. It's a great opportunity for me. I appreciate Pastor Fraz inviting me to come and share the Word of God with you today. It's always my pleasure, of course. And today, my topic is staying on mission. I think this is such an important topic, and I'm going to be looking today at the Book of Jonah. And Jonah is actually a very small book. You can read it just in a few minutes, but it really does pack a punch. And I've been studying Jonah over this past year, and it's amazing how Jonah speaks to the very times that we live in today. It's a great story, one that has captured the imagination of artists, of course, down through the years. And Jonah was a prophet who lived about 800 years before the time of Christ. The book of Jonah is unique among other prophets in that all of the other prophets were really contained the message of the prophet, where Jonah, the book of Jonah, is the story of the prophet. So it tells the story of the prophet. And unfortunately, I have to tell you today, it's not a success story at all. In fact, it really chronicles Jonah's failure. Now, imagine having a whole book of the Bible dedicated to your failure. I feel really bad for Jonah, but at the same time, it's encouraging for me. I'm highly encouraged when I read it because it just shows me again how gracious God is and how he chooses to use the foolish things of the world, and even, yes, he even will use failures. And so I want you to take encouragement from this today. I think, if we're really honest today, we know that Jonah's story in many ways is our story. And I'm glad that God uses failures. And I'm so thankful for stories like Jonah and other stories in the Bible that help us to avoid some of the pitfalls that we can so easily fall into in our Christian lives. Ultimately, Jonah's story is a story of hope. And God knows that we all need hope today in these times that we're living in. What some of you may not know, some of you know this obviously, but there are some of you that won't know that 25 years ago, we actually moved to Mississauga to pastor Heartland, a church connected. At that time, it was called Central Pentecostal Church. And what a lot of people don't know, 25 years ago, this church was slated to be closed by the district. And so we were contacted by the district, and we were at a very comfortable position in Ottawa, and the district approached us, the district superintendent. In fact, Brother Bill Morrow, who was our interim pastor just before Pastor Fraz, and he said, Gary and Ruth, if you will consider going to this church, we'll keep it open just to see what God will do. Well, here we are today, and we are rejoicing in what God has done. But back in those days, it was a church that was slated to close. And by all appearances, this experiment of establishing another strong Pentecostal testimony in the central part of Mississauga had seemed to evaporate. And the dream, people were walking away from the dream. Many walked away, but there were a few faithful people. Some of you are still here today who sensed that deep calling of God on this church, because there was this sense that God was calling this church to do some incredible things in this city. And my friends, that calling is still there. I'm so thankful Pastor Fraz has been reminding us of that calling ever since he's gotten here. And I sense that he feels that call as well. And I'm so encouraged by that. He's also very wisely reminded us that we now stand at another crossroads in the history of our church. Here we are in this brand new day. We are now finally in this brand new building, and it's an absolutely beautiful building. For those of you that haven't been here, I've walked around, and it's just incredible to see what God has done. And that realization of this dream that we had all those years ago, many years ago, dreaming about the possibility of having a facility, a standalone facility on our own, so that we can can reach the city of Mississauga and the region of Peel and beyond. And, so here we are. We are at a crossroads now. And what do? Do we just kind of say, well, thank you, Lord. We've got our building now and we've accomplished that. And so, we're just fine with that. Or do we say, thank you, Lord, for these wonderful facilities, but God, now challenge us to take new, bold steps for you in this city and in this region. Here we are, we've got this building, as I've said, we've got this building, but we can't use it. It's heartbreaking in many ways. We can't use it. We're living in days like none of us have ever imagined we would be living in, even just a year ago. So what do we do now? Well, let me ask you this. Do you think that God's mission has changed? Do you think he's changed his mind about the mission that he's put us on? Of course not. You know that. Is God still calling us to reach our city for him? And of course, the answer is yes, he is. And I think that if this pandemic's taught us anything, it's reminded us of this, that the dream was never really about a building. It was always about the mission that God had us on, the mission to win people for Jesus Christ. The facilities are here to help us do that and just to help us accomplish the mission that God has us on. So how does this all relate to Jonah? You're wondering, how are you going to tie this into Jonah? Well, Jonah was also at a crossroads. Jonah was called by God to impact a city. Jonah had a choice to make. Was he going to follow God on his mission, or was he going to now run away from the mission and choose comfort? Jonah made the mistake of running away from the mission. And so we're going to look at what he did, and we're going to learn from that so that we don't make the same mistakes as we follow God on mission, as we attempt to stay on mission. So we're going to read the scriptures today. Jonah chapter 1, verses 1 to 6. And you can read along with me. The word of the Lord came to Jonah, son of Amittai. Go to the great city of Nineveh and preach against it, because its wickedness has come up before me. But Jonah ran away from the Lord and headed for Tarshish. He went down to Joppa, where he found a ship bound for that port. After paying the fare, he went aboard and sailed for Tarshish to flee from the Lord. Then the Lord sent a great wind on the sea, and such a violent storm arose that the ship threatened to break up. All the sailors were afraid, and each cried out to his own God. And they threw the cargo into the sea to lighten the ship. But Jonah had gone below deck, where he lay down and fell into a deep sleep. The captain went to him and said, "How can you sleep? Get up and call on your God. Maybe he will take notice of us so that we will not perish." If you study the book of Jonah, you quickly realize that it really is a book for the times that we're living in today. This call of Jonah in the chapter 1 that we've just read about has really some important lessons for us today as we stand at a crossroads in many ways as a church. It speaks to us about aligning ourselves to the heart of God and how to stay close to his mission. It recalibrates us to the true mission of God. What is the true mission of God? It's not just, as I said, it's not just about a new building, but it's about following God into places where he wants to call us to win people that he's trying to reach. And so this passage today encourages us to stay on mission, the mission of seeking and saving the lost. And if we're going to do that, we need to make some choices. And the first choice that we need to make is to choose, is to practice irresistible grace and acceptance. We need to make that choice that we're going to be people of grace and acceptance. We live in a world that with social media 25 years ago when I came to Heartland, that wasn't even a thing. With social media now and cancel culture and all of these things, it's so easy to just write people off. But God is calling us to be people of grace. He's calling us to be people of acceptance. The truth is, we're all in need of grace on a daily basis. And too often we don't receive it because we're afraid of being honest with one another. We're afraid of being honest with the struggles that we're going through. Instead, we learn very early on to put on the religious masks so that people can't see the real us. And we're just afraid today of judgment. We're afraid of being judged. We're afraid of being canceled. I've had numerous people tell me down through the years that when they faced major struggles and storms in their family, their impulse was to not let the secret out. It was something that had to be guarded, and they would say things like, what will people at church think if they ever find out about this? And so that's really unfortunate, because while the church should be a safe place where we can come and share our needs and our struggles, our burdens, the heartaches that we're going through, oftentimes the church is a place where we're afraid of being judged. God, deliver us from judging people. Let us be a people of grace and acceptance. And of course, when that happens and we start putting the masks on, the result is that we all start looking pretty much the same after a while. We come to church and we're all very comfortable with one another. There's comfort in the familiarity of everyone and everything. And there's comfort in predictability. Let's face that. We don't like things to change too much. We get used to the people that we get used to. We surround ourselves with those people, and we just kind of slip into our comfort zone with those people. But God calls us to reach people that don't fit into our mold sometimes. And what happens when God calls us and when he nudges us to get out of our comfort zones? Well, Jonah received a call from God to be on mission. The wording here in verse 2 indicates an urgency to the mission. I love what it says in the Message translation. It says it this way: up on your feet and on your way to the big city of Nineveh. Preach to them. They're in a bad way, and I can't ignore it any longer. You see, it wasn't a suggestion. It was more like God saying, and if you look at the original language that's being used here, it's more like God saying, I'm breaking in. I'm ready to break in. I'm ready to do something that will blow your mind. Now get up and be a part of what I'm about to do. And that's the message that God was saying to Jonah, and I believe that he's saying it to us today as well. Get up and be a part of what I'm about to do, because I am ready to break in. The problem for Jonah was that the target of God's affection didn't line up with his. Because it's easy enough to offer grace and acceptance to people who are just like us, but so much harder to offer it to those with whom we maybe never would associate with in the first place. But friends, we need to remember that grace stretches the limit. It's not surprising that Jonah was sent. I mean, Jonah was, after all, that was his profession. He was the prophet. The surprise is in who he was called to, the people that he was called to. Israel's prophets were always sent to Jewish people. But God calls Jonah to go to these Gentile people. He says, go to Nineveh. Now, just a little bit about Nineveh. Nineveh was a very strategic city in the region. It was the capital of Assyria, the reigning empire of the day. It's actually the modern day city of Mosul in Iraq. There was a population of about 120,000 people, which was a huge population in that day. Its walls were 100 feet high, and the walls of the city were so thick that 3 chariots could travel side by side on them. That just tells you of what the great fortress this was. The Assyrians actually weren't very nice people at all. In fact, if you really study this, you'll find that they were the original terrorists. They were the terrorists of the day. They were like ISIS of that day. And so they were also the people that persecuted the people of Israel, the very people that Jonah was a part of. They persecuted his tribe, as it were. And they were sworn enemies of Israel and were thriving at a time when Israel was barely holding on for dear life. Despite all of this, we see that these despised Gentiles, these terrorists, were actually the target of God's affection. God sees these people as having value, people with dignity, people made in his image. He has compassion on them, like sheep without a shepherd. And Jonah is shocked by the grace of God, that God would extend grace to these horrible, horrible Assyrians. That's what was in his heart. And God says to him, you go to Nineveh. It was something that he would have never expected. You know, the work that I do right now, as many of you know, is with the persecuted church around the world, strengthening our brothers and sisters around the world in places where faith costs the most. And I have to tell you that I'm really no giant of the faith in comparison to the 209 million Christians worldwide today who face very high to extreme levels of persecution just for following Jesus. The times when I visited our brothers and sisters on the field, I'm always come away so humbled. I'm humbled because I see their responses to what they're going through. I see even their responses to their persecutors. I'm challenged because I wonder if I would be able to offer the same kind of grace and acceptance if I were in their position. These people that I've met, they're not trying to run away from persecution or to build up barriers so that they can stay safe, because they sense a calling of God on their lives to stay right where they are, to be the light of Christ in some of the darkest places on earth. To me, they're living examples of the shocking grace of God, and they teach us that with God's help, we can offer grace and acceptance to people that are radically different from us. And it's that grace that is offered that becomes irresistible. I often comment that when I'm with the persecuted church, I feel like I'm living in the Book of Acts. Well, if you look in the Book of Acts, you'll know that it wasn't a community of perfect people. There were a lot of failures. And they were just a bunch of ragtag fishermen, tax collectors, and even persecutors. But it was also, we know, a community of grace, shocking grace, where acceptance could be found. There was this climate of authenticity, a climate where people didn't have to put masks on to live in a Christian community, but there was this authenticity, and there was a unity in that authenticity. And that unity and that authenticity ushered in a visitation of the Holy Spirit. And the church exploded in the Book of Acts because it was a community of grace. Just as the church today, the fastest growing church, Pastor mentioned it last week, that the fastest growing church in the world today is where there's great persecution in the country of Iran. And we find that where there is persecution and people are still living out their mission in God, offering grace and acceptance and demonstrating that grace and acceptance, the church is growing by leaps and bounds. And so that leads me to my next point today, and that is we need to choose mission over comfort. That means that we have to remain steadfast in our commitment to doing what God has called us to do. The church has no shortage of defectors. people who have lost their burden for the lost and have abandoned the mission of God in exchange for just their own personal comfort. I think that after a while, their hearts become closed to the change that's necessary to win new people. And they are more concerned with the people that they already have, the ones that they feel most comfortable with. The problem is, God didn't call us to live in our comfortable bubble. God didn't call us to live a life of comfort. He didn't call us to live in cloistered communities. He said, go. And he decides where we go. Just like he decided that we would be here at 1100 Canadian Place in the city of Mississauga. He has sent us on a mission. He sent us on a mission. Verse 3 of this passage tells us that God told Jonah to go, and Jonah did exactly what God told him to do. He went. He got up and he went. He went down to the seaport, he found a ship, he paid the fare, and he jumped on board and he went. The problem was, God told him to go east. Jonah went west. If you look at the map on the screen, you'll see Jonah goes actually in the exact opposite direction. He actually ends up going to the coast of Spain, as scholars believe it was the coast of Spain that he went to. And that was as far away as the then known world could get you, basically. That would, in their minds in that day, that was the very end of the world, once you reach the coast of Spain. And so this was like I'm going to the end of the world, Jonah is saying. And how more dramatic can you get? and why did he do that? Well, did he do it because of the Assyrians and therefore it was too dangerous for him to go? I know many people that would be dissuaded from going on mission with God because they feel it's too dangerous. Or was it because he felt that it was just a futile mission? There's no way that we'll ever be able to reach these people, these terrorists, these people that actually terrorize the people of God. How can we ever reach them? I'm sure that he had that thought as well. Or was it because he felt that he was a traitor if he went there? Because after all, he was being called to go to preach to the very people that were persecuting his own people. And maybe he would feel a bit of a traitor in going there and sharing the love of God with them. I don't believe any of those were the reasons that Jonah didn't go. I think the reason that Jonah didn't go was because he was repulsed by the idea that God would love the people of Assyria. He had also forgotten the shocking grace of God that was extended to him. He has this idea that God only loves good people, and I'm good. I'm the good people. I'm the kind of people that God likes. I'm the kind of people that God loves. And here's another shocker for you. Who's the bad guy in the book of Jonah? Turns out that it's actually not these people at all that he's so repulsed by, these people that are so repulsive. It turns out to be the preacher. It turns out to be Jonah. Scholars believe that when Jesus told the parable of the prodigal son in the New Testament, he was in many ways referring to this very story. Do you remember the self-righteous older brother in the story of the prodigal son? He hates his father because the father has mercy on the younger brother, because his dad shows this outlandish grace towards this younger brother. Jonah is the older brother here. Jonah is more comfortable with a God who hates the people that he hates and hates the things that he hates. And if God is not going to be like that, then Jonah is not going to be in his service. That's what was in his mind. And so what does he do? He bolts. He chooses comfort over mission. But it was just perceived comfort, wasn't it? Jonah pays the full fare, but he actually didn't get to where he wanted to go. And staying on mission has its price. Yes, it does. We're told to count the cost in joining Christ in his mission. But let me tell you, folks, that choosing comfort over mission has even a greater cost. Pandemics are really nothing new to the church. In fact, if you look back in church history informs us of times when the church grew by leaps and bounds. The church exploded actually in times just like we're living in today. Amazing, isn't it? And why is that? It's because when the plague swept the Roman Empire, most of the people that were living in the cities would just run out to the countryside. They just ran away. They wanted to try to save their lives, and so they would go out into the countryside, and they were afraid of catching these horrific infections, and so they would just run away. But the Christians had a calling, and their calling was to stay and minister to people who were in need. To stay and minister to the people who were sick. That's how a lot of the hospitals and all of these things happened. It would have been easier for them to say, you know what, I'm going to take care of my own comfort. I'm just going to get away and hide away until everything is all over. But rather than do that, they ran to the mission. They ran to the mission. And yes, many of them, they died in droves. So many deaths of Christians. But Christianity spread like fire and gained credibility because of the sacrifice, because they chose mission over comfort. I'm not saying that we should go out and be reckless in the midst of a pandemic. You know that I'm not saying that. And these people weren't trying to make any political statements by staying together and trying to meet together and all of that stuff. It was none of that at all. It was just a pure desire and a sense of calling on their lives that God had called them to minister to the most needy of their communities. And so they ran to these people and ministered to them, and the church grew because of it. There are ways that we can reach out to our neighbors as well. Maybe it could be just picking up the phone. I know that we can't be visiting with neighbors and so on, but there are telephones, there's email. We are in an age where we've never been more connected with all of the digital capabilities that we have. And so it's important for us to watch out for that person who may need that encouraging word, who may need that encouraging whatever you can do for them in the safest way possible. We are here on mission. My final point today is this, is that we can remember that there is mercy in the storm. Because there is redemption, and in this story, there is a lesson for all of us. And that is to remember that there is mercy in the storm. One thing that I've come to learn is that God is always at work. We may not see how he's working. You may not see the way that God is working in the life of your family members that you're praying for, or those neighbors that you're trying to live a godly example before. But believe me, God is at work. Maybe you don't think that God is even at work in your own life. But again, let me tell you, God is always working behind the scenes. We may not always see that. We may not always perceive it, but we can know today that God is always at work. The other thing that I want you to know is that, and you know this already, but that is that people go through a lot of storms. And we know that especially today, because when we look around us, there are people that are having a pretty bad time with all that we're going through. We've all felt the effects of this. And we're hearing the reports of what people are going through. And people are in a lot of storms in their lives. It could be a storm of a relationship storm. It could be a storm of addiction. It could be a financial storm. It could be all kinds of different things, mental illness storm that they're going through right now. I want to tell you today that our mission is to meet people in the storm and not wait for them to find their way into our boat. Our mission is to go out there and find people right in the midst of the storms of life. And so often we've just waited for them to show up and then hopefully we can do our best. No, God is calling us. He's calling us to get involved in the storms that people find themselves in. Again, I think this pandemic has taught us that this mission is not just about us putting on good gatherings and doing all of the churchy things that we all love to do and that we're all longing to get back to, but that's not all there is to the mission. It's about getting out of the boat and learning to minister to people right where they are, not waiting for them to come to us. Well, this story of Jonah could have ended there. Jonah runs away from God. He gets on a boat. The boat sinks to the bottom of the sea, and we're all done. The story is done. But of course, you know that's not how the story ends. We see this tug of war happening between God and Jonah. And in verse 3, we see Jonah running away from God. And then in the next verse, in verse 4, we see God arresting Jonah. It says that God heaves a great storm to reclaim the prophet because God loved him so much, too much to let him go. There's mercy in the storm. If you're a child of God today and you choose to go off mission, if you choose to run away from God, you may be inviting a storm in your life. But again, my friend, there is mercy right in that storm. You may be going along and navigating your own life in your own terms and not giving much attention to God at all, and then all of a sudden a storm hits. And you begin to realize that being the superintendent of your own life hasn't really worked that well for you after all. And God allows a storm to come. God allows a storm to stir us up and to knock us down so that we can see the folly of trying to do life without Him. But again, my friend, there is mercy in the storm. These mariners threw Jonah into the wrath of God, as it were. But he survives because God had made a provision. And just like Jonah, when we find ourselves in the storms of life, in the midst of a storm, we can know that that is never the end for us because God has already made provision for us. Jesus, who's referred to as the second Jonah, was thrown into the wrath of God for us. The New Testament actually draws that comparison between Jesus and Jonah. Jonah spending 3 days in the belly of the fish and Jesus spending 3 days in the belly of the earth before he resurrected from the dead. Jesus, the second Jonah, was thrown into the wrath of God and he sunk to the bottom. He took the wrath of God for you and me so that we wouldn't have to take that wrath. That's His mercy. That's because He is a merciful God and that He shows Himself merciful in the storm. Jesus picks us up from the storms that we go through and so that we can join Him on the greatest rescue mission the world has ever known. And Jesus sets that a great example for us, doesn't He? He didn't keep His distance. He didn't stay in heaven, and he came to earth to live His life here, to show us an example of what it is to rescue people from the storms that they find themselves in. He came to seek and to save that which was lost. He went and He found people right where they were, and He calls us today to do the very same thing. We're not called to just sit in church. we are called, just like Jonah, to go. The choice is up to us, isn't it? What will we do? Will we continue to follow God on mission? Will we run away from the mission? Or we say, no, Lord, I'm sticking with the mission with you because that's the greatest life that there is. I trust that you choose to stay on mission. And so just think about that. Pray about it. As Pastor Kevin now leads us in a final song, one that we heard earlier, God of the City.